Hello, everyone. I'm Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our final event of #China Challenge campaign, a month-long series of events, articles, and analysis exploring China's various levers of influence across North America and Europe. So far, we've explored information, economic, digital, and this week, our focus turns into military and political influence. I'd like to thank NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for the support of these activities and encourage all of you to use #China Challenge to explore our previous week's events, articles, and continue to follow CEPA's work on China. Lastly, follow China's Influence Monitor newsletter by signing up at cepa.org. A partnership that we have with Coda Story, curated by our very own Senior Fellow, Edward Lucas. And now, I turn it to Edward Lucas, who will be chairing this week's discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to this CEPA discussion on Chinese political and military influence. I'm Edward Lucas, I'm a non-resident fellow at CEPA, and I edit the China Influence Monitor, which is our weekly look at China's westward footprint. And I'm joined by three panelists. We have Corey Cooper from Columbia Law School, founder of Black Voices on Greater China. We have Zach Cooper, who's a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-directs the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And we have Reed Standish, who's a correspondent for RFERL, focusing on China in Eurasia, and also writes a monthly newsletter on China's influence in that giant region. Welcome to you all. This is the third in a series of discussions. We've also previously looked at Chinese digital influence and Chinese information operations, but now we're going to look at the hard stuff of the political and military influence and what we can do to push back against it where we need to. So I'm going to go to you first, Corey. Tell us what's on your desk, what are you working on at the moment, and how are you trying to get it off your desk and into print or interaction?
So there are several international law and human rights issues that I'm in the middle of researching and writing up on. I'll give you a quick list and some remarks on that. So one of them is the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the CAI that was agreed upon in principle in late December of 2020. Another is China's continued pressure on world leaders not to have relations with Taiwan, Hong Kong and the national security law, the ways in which that's dismantling pro-democracy efforts there, the relation to this with public interest lawyers and how they're being prosecuted at increasingly terrifying rates, forced cultural assimilation in Tibet, and then of course, Xinjiang, many issues related to that, as well as the WHO investigation, business law decisions that have kind of come to a head during the Trump administration, but continue to remain issues, especially in US-China relations, the battle against sexist practices and for Me Too accountability in China, those detained as political pawns, the two Michaels, and the struggle for China to get back Meng Wanzhou from Canada, who was a Huawei executive. And the WTO remains in crisis, mainly as a result of US issues with China, the dispute over the South China Sea and human rights campaigns, the back and forth between China and the rest of the world. And then I would say, lastly, worsened India-China relations. Many disputes remain unresolved and have led to sanctions and an increased military presence. So a lot to say on all of these issues.
Well, thanks for taking us for such a long ride down the waterfront in such a short space of time. Those are all terrific, and any one of those we could spend 45 minutes on. I was particularly pleased to hear you highlighting the Taiwan question, because I think that's moving rapidly up the agenda. But there's a lot more there as well, and we'll try to get onto a lot of it. But Zach, let's turn to you next. We now see the PLA and China's military posture as the #1 problem on American decision makers' desks. How's the United States reacting to that? And in your view, are they doing the right thing?
Well, you're exactly right. There's been a long period where the United States, frankly, just hasn't caught up to the changes going on in China on the military side. We've seen decades of very rapid military modernization from China and not much of a response, frankly, from the United States. And I think we're now at the point where that's no longer tenable. And in particular, you've heard a lot of commentary in the last few weeks and months about the growing danger of a crisis over Taiwan. And I don't want to suggest that we could see a military crisis or conflict in the next few years necessarily. I think the time may be a little bit beyond that, where it would be most likely that Beijing might launch some type of military attempt to coerce or invade Taiwan. But there's a window now where the United States has to respond, and it hasn't done enough the last few years. And so we're starting to see that debate happen in earnest. I think the really difficult part of this debate is that there are some very hard decisions the United States will need to make. One path is going down basically the road we've already been down the last couple of decades, big investment in power projection forces, surface naval forces, big fixed bases. That doesn't seem particularly attractive. But the other route is towards a more denial-focused military capability using anti-ship cruise missiles and submarines and other kinds of capabilities that are a little bit harder for the Chinese to see and strike. That, I think, is the direction that the Biden team is likely to go, but it is going to be very hard politically. And so I think that's the debate we're starting to see emerge in Washington. I think it's a needed one. It's probably been waiting far too long, but hopefully over the next few months, we'll start to see some of these kinds of investments actually come out in the defense budget. And in some of the discussions from the Pentagon's China task force, and maybe also from the posture review that is on way in the Department of Defense. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that. Not exactly a cheerful prospect, but certainly a very stimulating one. Let me turn to you next, Reid, because one of the big differences between what this administration is doing and what the previous administration did is the search for allies. And we see a really energetic attempt to get European allies on board. We also are beginning to see the contours of Chinese influence in Europe, both in Germany and France and the big countries in terms of business, but also in the Western Balkans and other places with political influence. Talk us through what you're seeing there. Is China retreating or advancing? Have they overdone it with their wolf warrior diplomacy, or are they now consolidating the assets they've already got?
Well, I think especially what we've seen this week with these sanctions and counter sanctions over Xinjiang that we saw, both in the European Union, and then we saw this coordinated batch coming from the US, UK, and Canada as well. That Chinese reaction, those counter sanctions, I think, have caught a lot of people off guard. I think that's created perhaps more of a backlash than Beijing was expecting. And that's fed into a thing. It's been quite interesting just in the last few months. If you think that, 2020 ended with this comprehensive free trade agreement, or sorry, not a comprehensive free trade agreement, with this investment deal with China and the European Union getting signed, with a lot of people seeing as this, kind of big win for China just before the Biden administration comes in. But then, if we look in January and into February, it doesn't actually look like China is consolidating as quickly as it did just a few months ago. We had the 17+1 summit that happened in February, which I think had the lowest high-level representation to any summit since it's existed as a format. And you had 6 countries, I believe, not send a prime minister or a president to attend, even though that this was the first time that the 17+1 format was chaired by Xi Jinping. And then afterwards, we saw quite a lot of criticism coming out, especially within the Baltic countries. Lithuania has since announced that it's withdrawing, so this will be a 16+1 again, moving forward. And then obviously when we come back to what we've seen this week in terms of this negotiations and these talks over Xinjiang, and it's going to be ongoing as there's a lot of brands starting to pull out as well right now over concerns over the cotton production in the region. So I think it's definitely, in a lot of ways, I think that this style of diplomacy that China has been going for in Europe, I mean, it's starting to create a lot of backlash. But having said that, of course, I mean, when we look at Berlin, when we look at Paris, you know, the big countries that drive China policy in the European Union, there is still this desire to go a third way, not completely follow the United States on its China policy. There is this desire to preserve especially strong economic relations in that track moving forward. So I think that's where we're still in this kind of weird middle ground when it comes to Europe and China.
Yes, it's interesting that Europeans think that they can have a choice between the US and China, but that's not necessarily the way the Chinese see it. The Chinese making the choice already. So Corey, let's come back to you and drill down a bit more on this CAI, the investment agreement, because that, as readers and viewers rather will doubtless remember, was squeaked through at the end of the year by Angela Merkel amid some controversy. And since then, the controversy's only grown. What are the, from a legal point of view, what are the instruments that can be applied on this? Is this, I mean, it has to be ratified at a national level, so that's one thing. It's got to be ratified by the European Parliament. But give us your insights on the on where the CAI is now and what may happen to it.
Well, the CAI is actually in quite some trouble. It seemed like the backing was strong, especially from, as you said, Angela Merkel, as well as from France. But recently there has been a lot of damage to PRC-EU relations due to the destruction of H&M's China business over Xinjiang cotton. The issue comes over companies like H&M, Nike, and others having made statements about Xinjiang and forced labor, and thus the items that come from that area. And so as a result, it seems that, you know, in keeping with wolf warrior diplomacy, which you know, Chinese state media is now sort of trying to reject, even though they've used that term in the past, there has been a campaign to push these businesses out of China. And so now EU envoys have agreed to the first China sanctions in 3 decades. They've recently approved freezing of assets of 4 Chinese individuals and 1 entity. They've approved travel bans. And it seems as if the Xinjiang issue is going to become potentially the unraveling of this really groundbreaking agreement. That said, it's hard to say for sure what the future of this is. You know, the EU has resisted US pressure to, the buzzword has been decouple from China completely for some time. So, you know, it remains to be seen what's going to happen exactly with this agreement.
Yes, it's certainly going to keep us all busy. But this, Reid, let me come to you next, because this H&M story, these Western retailers, H&M, of course, a Swedish one, which is a particularly sensitive issue. There's a very binary choice here for European countries. You either stand up for human rights and distance yourself from the regime, or you do I always hate the use of the word kowtow, but you basically sign up for the Chinese line, and you don't and abstain from any criticism. And it's a pretty hard choice for Western companies, isn't it?
I agree, it is. And you know, for that reason, I think businesses are sort of being called upon to step up. And this is relevant to those interested in legal studies, because increasingly businesses are sort of incorporating their mission statements into how they interact on the global stage. And so now human rights organizations are looking to businesses to see if they could be potential leaders in pushing a human rights law agenda. I think that, you know, especially from the US perspective, I remain skeptical about that potential, but it is an ongoing debate among international legal scholars. And so I think that, you know, there's also a potential question of, is there a breach of contract issue that can be litigated? A lot of Chinese stars and artists have said that they're no longer going to work with Nike and similar companies over the Xinjiang cotton dispute. But again, that's an issue that needs to be developed further before we can figure out where it's going to go.
Reid, what's your take on this?
I think it's quite, I mean, I think it's highlighting, again, this is what we're seeing in foreign policy or anything right now. I mean, this more forward-leaning, I mean, in a lot of cases, aggressive kind of, line coming from the Chinese Communist Party, or whether it's, just in Chinese foreign policy in general. I mean, it's really making it tough to sort of follow this line that whether a lot of companies have had, a lot of countries have had, which is a way to kind of, balance those human rights concerns you might have about things happening back in China and still being able to preserve your bottom line in a sense. And that balancing act is just becoming increasingly more tenuous to preserve. And I think moving forward, I mean, this probably isn't going to be the last time we have an episode like that, or that companies are going to be facing a choice like this. So I think it's going to be very interesting and illustrative to watch, how everybody reacts. And, we're still kind of in the middle of this storm right now, but once the dust settles, I think it'll be quite interesting to see where everybody stands.
Let's go back to the question of alliances. We've seen the Biden administration trying to stitch up the Transatlantic Alliance again. Do you think that there's more success there than there is in the Trans-Pacific Alliance? I've noticed that there's been some reserve in some Pacific countries from being signed up too closely to a sort of global anti-China coalition. There's obviously the friction between South Korea and Japan, which doesn't help. But I've noticed some hesitancy in Thailand, for example. Give us a picture of where things are looking brighter and where they're looking dimmer for the administration.
Well, I think what's really interesting to me about the alliance dynamics is that actually the US has to talk in two different ways to its allies in the Asia Pacific region and to its allies in Europe. And both of them are willing to push back on China, but in different ways and at different times. So, what Corey and Reid were just talking about in Europe is really critical, right? These values issues, they are really important to our transatlantic partners and allies. And if we don't talk about those values issues, then often what you're left with is sort of European cooperation with China on economic issues, and not a lot of pushback against some of Beijing's destabilizing activities. On the other hand, if you look at Asia, those values issues are actually pretty tough sells often, right? So a lot of America's closest friends in the region, they don't want to talk that openly about the differences in values between themselves and China. They have very close trading relationships with China, but they're willing to push back against Beijing mostly on the security side. So you might not hear Japan talking a huge amount about Xinjiang, but you'll hear a lot about East China Sea and increasingly even about Taiwan and other security issues. And so I think this is the real challenge for the Biden team. And frankly, I think they've done quite well so far. They're going to have to talk to the Europeans about a different set of issues than they talk to our Asian allies about. And that's something, frankly, that the Biden team, I think, is really well placed to do, but the Trump team was not, right? For the Trump team, values were just not going to be at the forefront. And I think that's part of why they struggled so much in Europe. And so now, the speech that Tony Blinken gave earlier in the week, talking a lot about democracy and values, I think that's very much focused on what Europe cares about. But then when you talk in Asia, you're going to hear a lot more about security issues and delivering real value for the region, like the Quad did about 2 weeks ago. So those two differentiated messages are going to be tough to pass along, but I think the Biden team is on the right track.
It was very interesting at the trial of the two Michaels, particularly Michael Kovrig. According to the Canadians, there were 28 diplomats from 26 countries there, and it was like a kind of snapshot of who cares about human rights in China, really. A very good turnout from Europe and from the UK. I think there were 5 big EU countries that didn't come: Poland, Bulgaria, Greece, among them. But it was startling lack. I didn't think there was a single country from Latin America, a single country from Africa, or a single country from Asia, apart from, unless you count Australia and New Zealand as being sort of Australasia. So, Corey, what do you make of this? How should we interpret the alliance building? Is it security for one group of countries and values for another, or is there a way of extending the values envelope? For example, I'm baffled that Muslim countries don't care more about the oppression of Muslims in occupied East Turkestan or Xinjiang, to give its Chinese name. Is this a card that the administration could maybe play more skillfully, or is it best left to other countries and not one that America should?
Wow, I wish there was a snappy answer for that, but there really isn't. I think that, you know, there is an ongoing sort of battle in the US over whether or not there's a future for multilateral cooperation as opposed to bilateral cooperation. There's also sort of a quasi debate on whether or not there's a future for values-based exchange. I think that, you know, going to Zach's point, he's exactly right. You know, in contrast to the Thai, you know, we see that there are agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, as well as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative. These are alternative sort of legal systems and dispute resolution mechanisms that have been critiqued for not being more concerned about human rights and, you know, also sort of upholding the status quo in the international law regime. I think that, you know, in terms of alliances, this is also an issue for the WTO because the US's critique of China under the Trump administration has turned into refusal to engage that has prevented the WTO from adjudicating. And so the WTO is simply not able to function. It does so on a minimal means through sort of like temporary interim bodies. But, you know, as Zach said, there's a lot that needs to be done, I think, to re-engage. I think that, you know, for the US, the Biden administration's posture is that it does want to sort of come back to the negotiating table with other countries. I think that the Trump administration, they tried to sort of do it by themselves and even use extra legal measures to sort of coerce China into doing what it wanted. So, for example, the dispute over TikTok, it's kind of gone quiet under Biden, but it was a really contentious dispute during the Trump administration that essentially went nowhere because the Trump administration essentially repeatedly tried to ban TikTok without having the legal precedent to do so. There were just not the prerequisite evidence to show that TikTok posed a sufficient security threat in order to actually, you know, shut down its operation. And so what essentially was happening over and over again is in the 11th hour, a judge would say, no, TikTok can survive another month or something. And so this is all to say that there are, you know, multiple international bodies that I think the US is going to come back to. As we've seen, you know, they came back to the climate deal with like the Paris Climate Agreement, and they're also kind of re-engaging with China and Alaska, as we saw. But, you know, and this involves values, that's going to be very difficult to do because given the current political climate in the US, China has a lot of, you know, ability to fire back. And they have been doing so sort of in a tit for tat manner. I was really struck by the way in which also the language of human rights is sort of being appropriated and manipulated. I think foreign policy, you know, Yang, I think his name is Jichi Wang, or Jichi Yang, foreign policy ambassador, he said that the United States has its style of democracy and China has the Chinese style of democracy. And it's not up to American people to evaluate how it's going to, you know, administer its democracy. Black Lives Matter and anti-Asian violence and gun violence has also been brought up by Chinese diplomats as sort of a take care of rebuilding your home base before you critique China points. A lot of this has been unfolding on Twitter, which is interesting. And, you know, in a way, this platform has been used to spread a lot of disinformation. And so I think that while values and alliances are something that, you know, are going to be important, not just for the US, but for other countries to sort of come together on to confront China, I also think that, yes, there is a way in which the US especially needs to sort of rehabilitate itself so that it is in the position to effectively mount a human rights critique against other countries.
Zach, let me come to you on that, because there's a kind of tension here between the feeling that multilateral organizations haven't always been great for the United States, and there's a lot of countries that are sniping at America from a self-interested point of view, and all that put a lot of steam in the boiler for the Trump administration's America First approach. And yet there's also the feeling that if you want to constrain China, you're going to have to make multilateralism work, and that may mean America swallowing some things that it would rather not, the United States swallowing some things that it would rather not swallow. How's that discussion playing out, do you think? And do you think we can expect to see a bipartisan approach to China, or is the tactical dilemmas behind dealing with China, are they so sharp that they will make any bipartisan approach impossible?
Well, let me take the second part of that first, because I mean, I'm very hopeful that we can maintain a largely bipartisan approach to China. It's never going to be perfect. There's going to be sniping from both sides, but I think there's a strong logic to it. I am very worried that, you know, the same kind of partisan bickering that we have on Middle East issues, on Russia issues, could infect the China policy world. And I think it's critical that it doesn't. And, you know, I've tried to do my little part on that. We did a task force at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a bipartisan task force on how to push back against authoritarianism. You know, I think those kinds of bipartisan efforts are critical. And the person who I ran the Alliance for Securing Democracy with until 2 months ago is now the lead China expert at the White House. So I think we have those connections, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of listening, which is something we're often not that great at. And not just domestically, but to go back to what you were talking about on the multilateralism side, I think the US is going to have to realize that the US doesn't always have to be in the lead. Actually, one of the best things from the last few years is that Japan is stepping up, right? That at times the UK appears to be stepping up, as it has with this discussion of the D10 grouping. So the US doesn't have to lead on every issue. In fact, we're better off when our like-minded countries take the lead on certain issues. And so I've argued before that I think we have to have not one alliance for democracy or alliance of democracies, but at least 4 different shifting coalitions to push back against China. One on the security side, another on the economic side, another on technology, and then a final one on governance and democracy issues. And I think we're starting to see each of those come together, but they're not all going to be led by the United States, and that's just fine. In fact, I think it's good to show that this isn't about a US-China competition. It's about China trying to change rules that lots of countries around the world think are important. And that's part of why I think what's happened the last few weeks with the Europeans on human rights issues has been so critical. You mentioned the 2 Michaels. So the last time that I was in Beijing, it was on a small trip with Michael Kovrig. And I will tell you, you know, as a friend of Michael's, watching what's happened to him the last 2+ years has been terrifying. And I think we all have to focus on making sure that we stand with Canadians, right, against the pressure that their 2 citizens are feeling, but also, you know, with Australians against the economic pressure that they're feeling. And so I would expect that the United States is going to have to be very supportive of its allies and partners as we push back against China on certain issue sets, but that there are times when the US actually shouldn't be in the lead in that effort.
It's a great idea. I love this idea of the different coalitions and also how we could build resilience into the system. So if one country's exports to China are targeted, other countries then say, we'll try and buy some of your surplus wine or whatever it is. But Reid, let me come to you, because I think it's really important that it isn't always the United States that does the leading. When I look around Europe, I don't see many countries that are really capable of it. You know, France is in a bit of a mess with Macron having his own sort of slightly eccentric policies. Germany's heading into an election and a long period of coalition building. Italy is not a sort of great geopolitical force. When you look around Europe for countries that are really taking the lead on China, you go down the list, you get to Lithuania, which is a fantastic example of a country of 3 million people trying to make a difference. But it is kind of, you know, less than 1% of the population of the EU. So where do you see the leadership coming from in Europe?
Well, I mean, I think that that's maybe part of the issue of what we're seeing is, I mean, obviously, yeah, as you raised that there's, France and Germany, I mean, they're obviously the linchpins and the leaders of European foreign policy, but they clearly seem to have a different point of view when it's coming and looking at China. And then obviously that when you look at Germany, there's obviously the issue of what's going to happen after Chancellor Merkel leaves. So I mean, that I think that there's a lack of leadership on China right now in Europe, and we're witnessing that playing out at the moment. I thought it was interesting, both Borrell gave a presser not too far after China imposed the counter sanctions, and despite MEPs being on that list, it really wasn't even mentioned at the EU level, which I found was quite interesting to me. But I think one part of the European Union that does seem to be following a harder China line is it's a lot of the East, it's a lot of the countries that joined the EU, that joined NATO, in the later stages in 2004. Lithuania is obviously a big example, but also, I mean, Estonia as well. I mean, to a degree, Latvia. But it's largely countries that are very reliant on the United States as a security guarantor, and they're countries that tend to see Russia as their #1 security threat, and actually don't really rely that heavily on China economically. So there's very few, levers of influence. If China says it wants to, restrict some sort of import of a product from Lithuania or Estonia into China, I mean, that's such a small part of their economies, it doesn't really make much of a difference to them. Whereas, for countries like, the big countries that run EU foreign policy, they need China economically, and so they're going to be, riding this straddling a very different line and have a very different calculus at play. But that sort of highlights there is a bit of a leadership gap and kind of some schizophrenia that happens on China within EU foreign policy.
I suppose it's also worth noting the European Parliament is perhaps, which is not the repository of foreign policy authority in the EU, is bang the drum pretty hard on China, and that's interesting. So I want to do a little segment on Taiwan now, because Corey, you mentioned that at the beginning, and it seems to me that Taiwan is perhaps the most difficult issue in a way, because it's the one that the Chinese have made made so totemic. We can put up with less trade, fewer visits. There's a lot of resilience actually in the sort of Western Chinese relationship, and there's been lots of friction in the South China Sea and so on, but it's all quite well-trodden ground, and the red lines are still somewhere apart. But it seems to me that on Taiwan, there's a real the Taiwanese have perhaps played quite a quiet game on the sidelines, but the mainland China has made it into a really big issue where they say, we want to retake Taiwan, it's ours, we don't want any political contact. So and this is both a strength in that it intimidates countries, but it's also in a way a weakness. If you defy Taiwan and get away with it, as the Czech Republic did in the summer, then the Chinese threats look a bit empty. So let's do a quick round on that. Corey, you kick off. What do you see happening with Taiwan, and what advice would you give to decision makers who are trying to decide what to do in their country's relations with Taiwan?
So, China's most senior foreign policy official, Yang Jiechi, as I mentioned, he's taken a hard line against other countries, cozying up to Taiwan as he sees it, as China sees it. I think that in terms of EU relations, it does seem like, EU leaders are visiting Taiwan and sort of in a way like continuing relations anyway. France recently rebuffed warnings to not visit Taiwan. French senators, I think, are free to visit whoever they wish, and they do so. The foreign ministry of France said as much, and even though Chinese ambassadors and others have kind of continued an online campaign as well to discredit, sort of Taiwan independence and sort of an indigenous sort of affiliation and, bolstering that often happens in the social media realm as well as in the sort of legal realm as well. I think that, China, as Zach and Reed point out, China is not exactly like winning friends and influencing people right now. A Pew Research study has shown that negative opinion of China has risen all over the world, not in small part due to the initial cover-up of the origins of the coronavirus. And so right now, Taiwan also holds sort of a plum spot as sort of a haven right now, as a country that has beat the virus. And, given that journalists have been, kicked out of China, there's a lot of information constraint, arguably the locust of, a lot of, you could say, China study is now shifting to Taiwan, at least temporarily. So I think that for the US and for the EU and other parts of the world, there is potential for, a sort of strengthening of relations there, despite the continued hardline rhetoric from the CCP. At the same time, it's hard to say exactly what Biden's stance will be on Taiwan. There's a way in which tensions were so ratcheted up unnecessarily under the Trump administration, with phone calls happening and statements by Mike Pompeo, that, I think the Biden administration is sort of trying to, in a sense, press the reset button and get into a series of negotiations that may concede. And I think in the opinion of some international law critics, unnecessarily some points on Taiwan. But yes, absolutely, there is this way in which China continues to take a minority position in the legal, international legal realm on Taiwan, and it's hurt it, because Taiwan has alleged that the WHO excluded it from information that it should have known about the coronavirus, and that it did so from the beginning because of pressure from China, pressure from Beijing, I should say. So, I think that, we talked about values and alliances earlier. This is just another way in which, while the US has sort of hurt its standing on the global stage, I think China too has hurt its ability to sort of export its political influence.
Zach, would you agree that upping relations with Taiwan is a good way for American allies to spread the burden? That if the Taiwan issue is not just seen as a US-Beijing clash, but something where lots and lots of countries are sending politicians to Taiwan, they have offices in Taipei, they're pushing for Taiwanese inclusion into the WHA, that actually makes it much harder for China to escalate, because they're escalating against a large slice of the world rather than just against the United States. Is that something the way allies should be thinking about this?
A few years ago, I think I would have said yes. And now I'm not so sure. When I look at what Beijing has done, even the last few weeks, pushing incredibly hard against any country that's critiquing China's policies on Hong Kong or Xinjiang, I guess I'm just not that concerned. I'm not that convinced that actually Beijing's going to be that willing to change its approach to Taiwan. And I think that puts a premium actually not on having other countries stand up for Taiwan, which I think is important, but mostly on making sure that we have a strong military deterrent against the use of force or coercion against Taiwan. So I actually think, although in general, it's good for countries to stand up and support other democracies, in this case, I'm not sure it's going to change Chinese behavior. I think what will change Chinese behavior is largely on the military side. And it's a question of whether the Chinese leadership believes that at a reasonable cost, they could carry out an invasion potentially, or some other type of coercive campaign. And let's be very honest, the only countries that really factor into that decision are probably the United States, maybe Japan. It's a very small subset of global countries that have any say on the military question of whether China can take Taiwan. So although I think it would be a good thing for countries to increase ties with Taiwan and stand up for democracy in Taiwan, I'm not sure it's going to change Chinese behavior.
So it's a good thing to do, even though it may not work. Is that, Reid, is that the way it looks from Europe? Because I think Taiwan's becoming a sort of totemic issue in some European countries. We saw the Netherlands changing the status of their office from being just economic and cultural to being Netherlands Office Taipei with a different logo. We've seen the Swedish moderate party saying that if they win the elections in Sweden, they want to have do the same. Lithuania is talking of opening an office there, which again is fine because lots of countries do it. We saw the Czech visit. It's something that Europeans feel they can do. You can't send an aircraft carrier to the South China Sea if you don't have an aircraft carrier, but you can at least be nice to the Taiwanese. Is that just sort of performative gesture politics, or does it have significance, do you think?
I think it has a lot of significance, especially internally within Europe in terms of raising issues. I mean, signaling to, I think it's partly internal politics as well, to show that, okay, we're standing up for human rights abroad. We don't just only care about, making money for some big companies and gain access to a Chinese market. We're willing to stand up for, values, which I think is something that a lot of people in Western democracies, want their politicians to do. So, across Europe, I see it like that. But, if I can expand it out a bit, I know you're asking specifically in Europe, in my job, covering Eurasia broadly, from my kind of dockets from Eastern Europe all the way to Central Asia, once we get outside of Eastern Europe, I mean, it's a very different issue. I mean, basically, once we leave kind of the democratic world, or even pseudo democracies, I mean, nobody's really recognizing Taiwan. And then when we get onto the kind of big three issues for China, which are Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, I mean, you see generally everybody towing China's line quite a lot. And so there is sort of, yes, when we're looking in the EU, I think we see something very different about this. But once we start to expand our scope quite a lot, you can see that actually. I mean, China's been quite influential. It's built up a lot of, states that are willing to toe its line at international organizations and internally. We were talking earlier about, a lack of criticism from the Muslim world in Xinjiang, right? I mean, right now, okay, this is March 26th. This is going to air later, but, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Tehran right now. That's a line that, Chinese state media and the foreign ministry take up a lot, is saying, hey, if we're really doing this to Muslims in Xinjiang, how come nobody in the Muslim world is criticizing us? And that's because it has these strong economic links that's built up through Belt and Road, where, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all these different sort of, Pakistan, all these countries, they're very silent on this issue and don't even want to touch it because they know that that's the kind of thing that you jeopardize relations with Beijing about.
Thanks for mentioning Central Asia. And I'm sorry we didn't get onto it earlier, but just give us a quick upsum of what's happening there. Because I see that the Tajiks are worried about the Chinese border claims. There's continued friction on with ethnic Kazakhs being oppressed in occupied East Turkestan, or Xinjiang as the Chinese call it, and quite a lot of Chinese effort on the energy side, particularly with Turkmenistan. Is this a place where Russia and China are clashing, or where the Central Asians are feeling nervous, or is this a success story from a Chinese point of view?
I mean, I think it's, so, I mean, you touched on a bunch of things there. So, I mean, I think actually, when you're talking about Tajikistan and territory, I mean, I think this is a long-standing thing. I think that this is just general nervousness. And for a lot of time, how I read that is that's the Tajik foreign ministry feeling a need to respond because it's seeing these articles pop up in the Chinese press, which then angers people back home, and then they need to be shown as doing something. But other than that, I don't see a lot of oomph behind that. The issue of ethnic Kazakhs being in the camps in Xinjiang, I mean, this has been an ongoing thing. I mean, I used to live in Kazakhstan. I've reported on this myself. There was a huge kind of swelling of grassroots activism around this issue, but the Kazakh government has quite successfully, I think, clamped down on it. A lot of the leading activists, their organizations have been banned. They don't exist anymore. A lot of them aren't in the country. They've taken asylum in the US or across Western Europe or different countries like that. And there still is activism. I mean, there's pickets that happen all the time outside the Chinese consulate and the Chinese embassy, but they're pretty large scale. And then also nowadays, I mean, Kazakh police and officials are coming down to shut it all off. And because you're in this climate also where there isn't really a free press. So I mean, it's all coming from state media, which is controlled by the governments, which have towed the Chinese line quite consistently since the beginning of over
Right.
Xinjiang.
Good. We're almost out of time, but I just want to give a final question to Zach. There's a paradox in the way that China views the world. On the one hand, they want to exploit the international system to get rich and be safe. And on the other hand, they don't like the international system because it constrains them. Am I being too simplistic there? And just very briefly, which of those approaches do you think is going to come out on top? Just in a minute, if you would.
Well, I think the bottom line is that what we've seen is that China both wants to be part of the international order and as you said, get the benefits from it, but they want to change parts of that order. And look, I'm sympathetic to the view from some in Beijing, which is they didn't have a big say in making this order in the first place. So of course, now that China is stronger, many in Beijing want to shift parts of the order that they think are unfair. And look, I think there are ways that could be done. I'll be the first to say that I think the US hasn't been as willing as it should have been to alter parts of that system. But I also think that there are times when the United States has tried to bring China in, and China has proven fairly unwilling to alter its vision of what that system should look like as well, right? The World Trade Organization entry would be the best example of that. So bottom line is, I think China, it certainly does benefit from the order. Adjusting that order a bit would be possible, but the way to go about that, in my view, is not the way China has been going about it the last couple of years.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I'm so sorry we're out of time. We could have discussed for hours on just some of the topics we mentioned, let alone the whole panoply, but I'm sure we'll be back. I want to thank Corey Cooper from Columbia Law School, who's the founder of Black Voices on Greater China. You can follow her at Cooper_Esquire. Zach Cooper, who's at Zach Cooper, Research Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-directs the Alliance for Secure and Democracy, and Reed Standish of RFERL. If you don't already subscribe to his monthly newsletter on China's influence in Eurasia, please do so. He's at Reed Stan. And I'm Edward Lucas, the editor of the China Influence Monitor, produced by CIPA and Coda Story. Thank you so much for giving us your time for this discussion on Chinese political and military influence, and please stay tuned to more events from CIPA in future. But for now, goodbye.